I find that most parents in Westchester County really are not aware that the adult criminal justice system takes over once somebody is 16. My organization is involved working with local police departments, the district attorney's office, many of the hospital emergency departments, and the Taxi and Limousine Commission, especially around prom time, and doing panels for parents of high school seniors. And in those panels, we explain the laws to the students and the parents. So in other words, anyone going to a prom has to go to this panel discussion with at least one parent. And when the district attorney and the local police, explain the laws and explain the penalties, parents and students are shocked that even if a student is just 16 or 17, that they're going to be treated in the criminal justice system. I shouldn't say everyone, the vast majority of parents and youth in Westchester County think it's 18, and therefore they don't realize the penalties. So we have to do much more education, but quite frankly, I'm hoping we won't have to do that education because I'm hoping that the age will be raised.
It's a little absurd that it's just us and North Carolina who are the last two states that still try 16 and 17-year-olds as adults. And speaking as someone who was quite recently 16 and 17 years old, the whole thing is very frightening to me. I wasn't really aware of this until Raise the Age brought it to my attention.
I think many adults don't even realize that New York is one of the only two states in this union, New York and North Carolina, that have this as the age of criminality, and that these children are being stigmatized for the rest of their lives, because even once they come out of that system, if they turn their lives around and are going to be law-abiding citizens, they have a stigma attached to them. They can't get certain kinds of driver's licenses, they can't vote if it's a felony offense. There are many things that they are precluded from doing, and therefore makes it difficult for them to really work toward and maintain a law-abiding lifestyle, because so much of what goes on in a law-abiding lifestyle is unavailable to them.
I think it's unfortunate that New York is still one of only two states that haven't, come along with the thinking that the age of criminal responsibility should not be raised.
One of the biggest concerns I have about 16 and 17-year-olds being arrested as adults in the state of New York not only has to do with the present circumstances that they will find themselves in, but what it does in terms of mapping out where their future will go. I think it's a very important piece of public policy that the state of New York must begin to address.
Certainly with people 16 and 17 years old, the emphasis should be entirely, if not near entirely, on rehabilitating them and not just punishing them for something they don't really understand or something that they totally regret.
All the research shows that adolescents are in fact children, and that the human brain is not fully formed until the age of 25. We can't be imprisoning children, at 16 and 17 with the assumption that they ought to know better, because in most cases they don't.
We all feel that our kids are good kids and that the laws didn't need to apply to our kids in a harsh way, that they should be given a second chance. The problem comes when we're asked to feel the same way about our neighbors' children. And I can just tell you anecdotally of a friend who told me that DWI should have mandatory jail time. And her son was 16 years old, and as we discussed it a little bit further, I said, well, I'm sure your son will be driving soon, right? And you could see her starting to think it through, that maybe her son one day might grab a beer and happen to get into an automobile. And at that point, it was no longer a great idea to have mandatory jail time, because her son's a good kid.
Of those who are arrested and charged as adults in their 16 and 17 years for acts that are really acting out and inappropriate behavior, but not necessarily criminal behavior, will have the negative consequence of disallowing them to go to college in many instances, certainly from receiving scholarships or any kind of aid or support for college, and could very likely be the difference to whether they will have lifelong employment or a life of unemployment.
Would you like to see your child or a relative or even a friend's or neighbor's child arrested, thrown into the county lockup with violent adult criminals, go to criminal court, and run the significant risk of having a criminal record haunt them for the rest of their lives?
If your child goes away to college, no one's necessarily going to know who your child is. No one may care. And when you're upstate in New York, or if you happen to be in North Carolina, the only other state in the union that still treats children as criminals without the ability for them to receive alternative consequences for their criminal conduct, you just have to realize that it could be your child, and that your child could say anything under the right circumstances, and that you wouldn't be able to call in favors from people you may know. Your influence may not extend to that town, and you may never know that your child is incarcerated in the first place. So even if that's not the case, it's simply bad business. It's simply bad business, and it's a poor taxpayer's decision to minimize and weaken your own society. I think that by strengthening our society and investing in our kids and in looking at different ways to treat young people, in particular in their formative years, we invest in our own, and we're much less likely to have to pay for them down the road. So it's a question of a nominal investment now or paying millions of dollars over people's lives in the long run.
There's very little in our system that has demonstrated to me that imprisonment, particularly of young people of this age, under 16 and 17 years of age, or even at that stage of 16 and 17, has been beneficial to anybody. It hasn't deterred the criminal activity, because as I said earlier, it not only doesn't deter it, but it puts them in situations where they really learn how to be criminals too often, because they're thrown in with the general population in many instances.
If you send young, impressionable youth into an adult system, what you're going to get back are well-educated criminals.
That's what we do today in New York.
The other thing is, if you look at Jeffrey Descovich, who's a very good friend of mine, Mr. Descovich was charged and ultimately convicted with a rape and a murder of a young lady that he went to high school with in Peekskill. And it turned out that he had been coerced into giving a statement, was beaten, and was in a fetal position underneath the desk before he gave that statement, but DNA evidence ultimately proved that he was innocent. And I can see any number of young people being in that circumstance. Mr. Descovich was released by the state, and now is living free and has engaged in work to help free other innocent people. But when you simply look at what young people may do under pressure, if you were to look at what adults sometimes will say or do under pressure, whether it's the Central Park Five or anyone else who's under custodial interrogation as a young person, as a child, without the benefit of parents and guidance, it's frightening, it's shocking. So those are some of the things that we need to consider when we're looking at this legislation.
Even though our studies show that youth in adult prisons are more likely than adults to have a substantiated record of sexual violence in their lives, sexual assault and abuse, are going to continue to have recidivism in the prison system, because even though they may have committed a misdemeanor, when they go to prison, they learn to become criminals.
It's fair thinking and it's prudent to have a system that addresses this issue, that looks at youth developmentally, that provides services that are appropriate for the developmental stage.
I think that it's very important that the criminal justice system and the system to deal with young people who violate laws really should be developmentally appropriate. I personally don't think that anyone should be incarcerated unless it's demonstrated that they are a danger to other people.
The idea that an adult system that is geared towards containing adults with the theory of rehabilitation really is, I think, just that. It's theory. As a licensed clinician myself, I certainly understand the issue of developmental stages. And as far as my thoughts on giving second or third chances, I myself, as a youth, was given many chances, second, third, fourth, fifth. I think it's just what happens during adolescence. It's that period where we try to test the boundaries. We take certain risks, and we don't appreciate the consequences, frankly, because that's the area of our brain that isn't quite developed until we're into our 20s.
Because young people's brains are developing, they often make decisions that aren't in their best interest and aren't well thought out. Someone once described an adolescent as a really great sports car that could go really fast but had terrible brakes.
I think you'd be hard pressed to find someone who could say that they haven't done something stupid when they were younger in their life. Now, I think the only difference is from person to person, not everybody gets caught all the time. I don't think anyone can really say they haven't done something that, if construed a certain way, they might find themselves in a jail cell, especially at 16 and 17 years old. And that's not true for everybody, but it's true for a lot of people. So when you just take the kids who happen to be lucky enough to get caught, and might be great kids otherwise, you jade them at a young age and you set their lives up for failure. You're not setting them up for success.
These are young people that really need treatment. I mean, certainly alcohol and other drug use is preventable, okay, but addiction is a brain disease, and we need treatment for diseases, not incarceration. I really think this is a critical issue. I think that New York needs to raise the age so we can stop stigmatizing young people, so we can offer them more options, and really try to make a difference in what's going on in the state.
I do believe that all youth are at risk. However, I do believe that black and brown youth, boys especially, are especially under attack for a number of reasons. I think you look at the communities they exist in, you look at the family systems that have broken down, and the system that certainly is not geared towards not just treating them as equals, but actually targeting them. And you look at racial profiling that is, I suppose now, July 19th, 2013, is ever more present in everyone's mind, that these boys are under attack. These kids are under attack by society, and unfortunately now questionably being condoned by the court system.
I believe all youth are at risk, but I think for black and brown youth, the risk is much greater.
I certainly think all youth are at risk for going to prison, but I agree that black and brown youth are disproportionately in prison, and I think that's primarily due to the fact that they are less likely to have access to good attorneys to try to keep them out of the prison system.
The truth of it is that it's happening to everybody, and it's a nightmare for any parent who has to go through with it, and it's terrible for the kids when they have to go through with it too.
All youth are at risk in the New York system, and of course we're speaking about only 16 and 17-year-olds. Minority of children and minority adults are arrested in disproportionate numbers. We know that, and they're incarcerated disproportionately. And children are sent to residential centers and locked up disproportionately. That's the bare fact, and we all ought to be trying to resolve the problem.
we deal in a world that is very punitive and very slow to forgive, if in fact forgiveness is ever given. And what I find is that depending on who your parents are and what your social circumstances are in terms of access to resources and access to power, you will be treated differently in the criminal justice system.
All youth are at risk. But there are some children who are more at risk. And part of it is if they are in poverty. And so that doesn't have a racial connotation. Poor children get in trouble like rich children. The difference is that poor children have fewer resources, and they have fewer opportunities and support systems that can smooth things over or get the courts to be lenient, or get even the police officers, the way they treat children based on communities that they're in, the economics of those communities, the color of those communities. There is a difference. It is almost as natural as their breathing.
This is the case largely due to policies. In fact, you can look at some of the policies our mayors and governors put into place in terms of stop and frisk, where you can have 90% of the people who are stopped and frisked in New York City, for instance, be charged with no crime. And that means that the police could not have possibly had a basis for stopping them unless, of course, the police are suggesting that they're wrong 90% of the time.
Black and brown youth are in many instances, they're segregated in terms of where they live and where they go to school and where their opportunities are.
You look at those policies and where they're implemented, and the fact that they tend to be implemented in poorer neighborhoods where African American and Latino youth are likely to live, and that tells the total story. In fact, if you were to go into more affluent areas where predominantly white youth live, and you were to stop and frisk every child in a very rich part of town, you'd find that they have at least as much in terms of narcotics, and you would have certainly an opportunity to arrest them and to cast their future in doubt. And when you even look at some of our elected officials and some who have fallen from grace and now are seeking to be elected again, those individuals come before us and beg for forgiveness and ask for an opportunity to make amends. But once they are elected, they pass legislation which prevents everyone else from having that same opportunity. The frustration I primarily have is watching, let's say, a young person in Mount Vernon get a stiff prison sentence for the same conduct that their counterpart in Bronxville may engage in, when that person in Bronxville sometimes ends up with no criminal consequences whatsoever. But even more than that, it's a lack of willingness on our part as a society to invest in our youth, and a lack of awareness that investing in our youth is really investing in ourselves. So whether we're talking about cutting school budgets, or we're talking about paying to incarcerate people at a clip of $50,000 a year or more, depending on what services that person may need, there seems to always be a willingness to invest in punitive measures, but never a willingness to invest in early childhood programs, or in after-school programs, or other mentoring programs, and things that would be preventative in nature and rehabilitative and empowering in nature.
When we make mistakes, specifically you have youth or juvenile offenders who are charged with nonviolent offenses, first or second time offenses, who are facing time at the state prisons. I think it's ludicrous.
I think that we are scared into passing legislation that's designed to keep us safe, when in fact it really doesn't.
It's a human behavior, and so that everybody is subject to. And yet, for instance, if they pick up a youngster doing something foolish, they may pull him over and look at his license, and the car is clean, and there's no problem. And based on the neighborhood or who they think the child's family is, they'll let him go with a warning. And we're not talking about serious infractions, but we're talking about, the non-public safety issues.
I'd like to see more of an effort by different groups. One thing I'd love or like to see a major effort by minority organizations, because the current system adversely affects minorities far more than non-minority children.
think there's some people against raise the age because they think that incarceration is a deterrent. And I think that's actually is inaccurate. I think also there are some people who want quote unquote justice, that a young person may have made a bad decision and did something, and the victim, and I understand this, wants justice and doesn't think that a young person should be allowed to get a second chance when their loved one who was the victim of a crime didn't get a second chance.
I think unfortunately a lot of it has been linked to the fact that these are minority, black and brown children who predominantly have the problem. You are inclined to feel that we don't need to do this for them or those people, rather than thinking in terms of raising the age and the accomplishment of all young people. I think once parents understand that sometimes their children are just a step away from being involved in the criminal process, I think once they're informed of the fact that this does not exist just for, or this does not just happen to black and brown children, but to all young people, it kind of changes their outlook.
There are just people who just believe that if young people commit an act just like anybody else, they ought to go to jail. And some of that is driven by this whole prison industry mentality that we developed some years ago. We built more prisons than any other president in the history of this country, as a way of giving a certain population employment.
Part of it is a fear of juvenile crime, part of it is simply bureaucratic inertia.
The only reason I can think someone is against raise the age would either be that you do not have the information about what raise the age actually means. You haven't contemplated that if you happen to have children that they also could find themselves criminalized in the state of New York, and that despite its suggestion that it is a progressive state, New York is one of the last 2 states in the country that has yet to raise the age. And the other would be if you work in the prison industry where you make money off of young people being in the criminal justice system.
I think a lack of understanding of what this campaign means for our youth would be the only reason. And honestly, I would say ignorance of the issue and clearly the will to do it.
Money and ignorance. Ignorance in just not knowing. There's ignorance in having a malicious opinion, but I think most of the people who are against it or even aren't for it really just aren't, informed to what's going on. I think if most people knew what was actually going on in New York State, then they would be a lot more sympathetic to something like raise the age. I think you're going to find, if you look hard enough, even if you look pretty easily, you're going to find ignorance wherever you go. And that's kind of like the baseline of what people have to deal with when they're making decisions as lawmakers and even as people involved in the community. So we kind of have to, it's up to people like, the people involved in raise the age to compensate for that ignorance.
It's been done, it's been proven, the statistics exist, the data exists about why raising the age of criminal responsibility to 18 is effective in preventing youth from recidivism, preventing youth from entering a cycle of reincarceration, to providing greater successes when the youth leave the system. So, I think the only thing that the argument that you would have for not doing it is not understanding what this campaign means.
I think the greatest barrier to changing the age for young people, in other words, raising it from 16 to 18, I think that old expression, the devil is in the details. How are we going to modify the probation systems? How are we going to modify the family court system? How are we going to have the, whether it's the public defenders or all the attorneys, work out all the details? What about the changes in any facilities? Are there enough rehabilitation services available in the state for people who aren't going through the criminal justice system?
the real biggest barrier is knowledge. Informing the public, educating the public, making sure that people know what's happening to their kids when they get arrested, when their 16-year-olds are going off to jail without the parents being notified. If more people knew, then I'm positive that more people would do something about it, or more people would be supportive of something like Raise the Age.
The greatest barrier is that we now live in an age where you have a 24-hour news cycle, and we have 3 stations that are on all the time and virtually feed us the same story, but with a slight twist. And you have Fox News, CNN, and MSNBC. And if you really look at the content of what they present, it scares you. It's almost designed to cause fear.
I think that it would be good to interview some young people who are 16 to 18 and let people see that they made silly decisions because they were high, or they were impaired, or they were in withdrawal, or maybe they were purchasing drugs for their chemically dependent parent or sibling, or maybe the gang told them that if you didn't sell drugs or transport drugs or something, that something would happen to their little sister. I think people would then begin to understand that so many of the young people that are charged with criminal offenses for substance abuse related issues, that there was really much more to the story.
I think everybody should have to see what goes on in everyone involved in decision making with regards to prison and putting kids through prison should have to see what prison is actually like.
The cost is so much less when we look at the intervention and the kinds of things that we can be doing. It costs anywhere between $45,000 and $60,000 a year for every young person that's incarcerated. And so that if we can come up with alternative programs that really work, we will reduce recidivism. We will lower the rate of young people, who are going in and out of the prison doors. We will ensure that many of these young people, with the proper intervention, are not going back to prison, and they're not picking up other behaviors that change their physiology and change their psychology in terms of how they see themselves.
I think one of the things that the Raise the Age proponents have alerted us to is the fact that it is cheaper in the long run to provide a more structured settlement segregated for young people only, rather than put them in an incarceration situation with adults. We've seen in other states, for instance in Connecticut, which is adjacent to Westchester County, that they've been able to do this and do it successfully. That the evidence shows that it works, that in terms of the impact and the cost of maintaining the criminal justice system, it is much cheaper and the results are much more positive.
We're always told that there's no money, but I tend to differ. When it's time to incarcerate someone, no one's ever set free because there's no money. When it's time for us to go to war, we never decide not to go to war because there's no money. We are willing to spend $4,200 per day in Westchester County to house homeless people at a shelter. And if we simply look at what we can do with that $4,200, if you were to give that money to the person who's being housed, I'm quite sure they could find a luxury apartment almost anywhere in Westchester County. So the money exists. It's just a question of the willpower and having the courage to agree that the money exists. And instead of incarcerating someone, again, at $40,000 to $50,000 or more $1,000 per year, we should be engaging in making education affordable, making sure that education is equally available to all, and that you don't have a lack of educational opportunities because your parents are poor and happen to live in a particular district.
I think it costs like $50,000 a year to house someone for a year in prison, and that's like a college tuition, essentially. You take the kids who are being put through an adult prison system at $50,000 a year, and you convert that money to giving them a rehabilitative, positive experience while they're incarcerated, or what have you, you're going to see a lot less recidivism, and you're going to find that all of a sudden we do have the money. You know, it's just, are you willing to spend the money where it needs to be spent?